The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that consumer prices rose 3.8% over the 12 months ending April 2026. That number should feel like good news. 3 years ago, inflation was running at 9%. But ask Marcus, a 34-year-old logistics coordinator in Columbus, Ohio, why his grocery bill is still $40 higher per week than it was in 2022. And he will tell you the math does not add up. The Fed kept rates elevated. Companies swore prices would normalize. And yet something keeps pushing costs upstream, invisible to every checkout screen and credit card statement. Marcus has been looking for the answer at the wrong address. The answer is not in a store. It is floating somewhere in the Indian Ocean, 12,000 miles away, on a cargo ship that took the long way around. Here is the paradox that should stop you cold. According to the International Monetary Fund's PortWatch data, an average of 36 container ships transit the Red Sea daily as of late 2025, down from 74 in 2023. That is more than a 50% collapse in one of the world's most critical commercial arteries. And yet the headline inflation number kept declining through most of 2025, making it look like the supply chain crisis was over. It was not over. It was just being absorbed in layers. And those layers are now landing on your purchasing power in ways that no single line item in the CPI captures cleanly. This video is going to walk you through exactly how that works. Not the vague hand-wavy version. The actual mechanism, with real numbers, so you can see precisely where your money is going before it ever reaches your wallet. Start with the physical reality. The Red Sea connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal. Roughly 30% of global container trade passes through that corridor, according to JP Morgan research. When Houthi militants began attacking commercial vessels in late 2023, every major shipping company, Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, redirected their fleets around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That reroute adds approximately 3,100 additional nautical miles to each voyage and extends Asia to Europe transit times from around 25 days to close to 45 days, a stretch of nearly 2 months when port queuing and congestion time are folded in. According to Freight Amigo's 2025 logistics report, the Cape reroute also boosts fuel consumption by up to 40% per voyage. By early 2025, container traffic through the Suez Canal had dropped 90% compared to March 2023, per maritime analytics from Sino Shipping. And the Red Sea was not the only bottleneck breaking simultaneously. The Panama Canal, which handles roughly 5% of global trade and is the primary route for Asia to U.S. East Coast container traffic, faced severe climate-induced water level restrictions through 2024, forcing draft limits that cut daily transits and pushed additional cargo onto already congested alternative routes. 2 of the world's most critical maritime shortcuts were compromised at the same time. Think about that for 1 second. A waterway that once handled nearly a third of global container trade is now essentially empty of commercial vessels because nobody can insure a crew at an affordable rate. And that brings us to the first hidden tax. War risk insurance premiums, which were once so negligible they barely registered on a freight invoice at under 0.1% of vessel value, had ballooned to between 0.7 and 1% of hull value by mid-2025, according to data cited by A-Invest. For a 10,000 TEU container ship valued at $90 million, that means the insurance surcharge alone adds approximately $360,000 per voyage. Carriers are not eating that cost. It is line item directly into the freight rate. And the freight rate is priced into every product on a shelf. Now stay with me here, because this is where the mechanism gets genuinely interesting, and this is the part most personal finance content skips entirely. A standard 40-foot container shipment from China to the U.S. East Coast now carries an additional $800 to $1,500 in freight premiums beyond pre-crisis rates, according to industry data from Swady Global Logistics. That sounds containable, but consider what gets packed into that container. A single container can hold 20,000 units of a household good, whether that is small appliances, clothing, or packaged food ingredients. Spread $1,500 in extra freight costs across 20,000 units, and you get a pass-through of about 7.5 cents per unit on the finished good. But that 7.5 cents is just the last invoice in a long chain. The same freight cost inflation hit the raw materials, the agricultural fertilizers, and the packaging components that went into that finished product weeks or months earlier on their own separate voyages. By the time something lands on a shelf, maritime disruption has been taxed into it at 3 or 4 different upstream stages. The 7.5 cents you see is the visible tip. The invisible portion was already baked in long before final assembly. But that container is not the only input cost that has risen. The warehouse that holds those goods after they arrive has also gotten more expensive. Here is what changed at the retail level. And this is the part Marcus in Columbus is feeling at checkout without understanding why. Before 2020, most major retailers operated on what the industry called just-in-time inventory. Keep the warehouse lean. Order frequently. Replenish as needed. The logic was elegant. Hold less inventory, free up capital, reduce storage costs. The system worked brilliantly when ships arrived on predictable schedules. But a survey published in December 2025 by supply chain researchers found that 87% of retail supply chain leaders are now increasing buffer inventory to hedge against volatility. 87%. That is not a marginal adjustment. That is a structural reversal of 2 decades of lean logistics philosophy. Why does this matter to you personally? Because warehousing is not free. When a retailer shifts from lean inventory to deep buffer stock, they are financing that inventory. They are paying interest on goods sitting in a warehouse. They are paying higher lease rates because warehouse vacancy in the U.S. fell as demand surged. Every dollar of capital tied up in buffer inventory is a dollar that has a carrying cost, and that carrying cost gets embedded in the retail price. The National Retail Federation estimated that persistent stockouts were costing retailers nearly $1 trillion globally in lost sales annually. The response, which was to hold more inventory, simply transferred that cost burden to a different line: storage, financing, and ultimately the consumer. This is the mechanism behind what economists are calling sticky inflation in goods categories. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta tracks a sticky price consumer price index, which measures the subset of goods and services that change price infrequently, things consumers buy regularly and expect to cost roughly what they cost last time. Goods that change price slowly tend to embed longer-term cost expectations into their pricing. And when those goods absorb rising logistics and warehousing costs, the price elevation tends to persist even after the immediate shock subsides. Now let us put real numbers on what this means for an actual household. Meet Priya, a 29-year-old teacher in Phoenix. She earns $58,000 a year, take home roughly $3,900 monthly after taxes. In 2021, her discretionary income after housing, transportation, and food was approximately $700 per month. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, food at-home prices are 2.9% higher than a year ago, as of April 2026. That sounds modest, but it compounds on top of the cumulative gains since 2021, during which grocery prices rose approximately 25% in total. For Priya, that 25% cumulative increase on a $400 monthly grocery spend means she is now spending roughly $500 per month on groceries. Not because she changed what she eats, but because every input cost in that supply chain, freight, fuel, insurance, warehousing, reset to a higher baseline and has not fully retreated. Her discretionary income did not stay at $700. It eroded toward $500 or less, not from any single price spike she can point to, but from a slow bleed across dozens of categories simultaneously. That is the invisible tax of maritime disruption. It has no entry on your bank statement. It has no press release. It just shows up as the quiet shrinkage of what your paycheck can actually buy. There is a second layer that most analysis completely misses, and this is worth pausing on. Liquefied natural gas is a commodity that most Americans never think about, but it travels by ship. A large share of U.S. LNG exports move through maritime corridors that overlap with the disrupted zones. When shipping capacity tightens and insurance costs surge, LNG transport costs rise. That feeding pressure eventually shows up in European energy prices, which affects the operating costs of the factories that make the goods the U.S. imports. The disruption is not confined to a single commodity lane. It propagates through the cost structure of everything that moves on water, and water moves about 80% of global trade by volume, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves through that narrow corridor between Iran and Oman, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Tensions between the United States and Iran have kept that passage under sustained threat through 2025 and into 2026, with periods of naval escalation forcing tanker operators to purchase additional war risk coverage on top of what they were already paying in the Red Sea. When oil transit through Hormuz becomes uncertain, crude prices spike. When crude prices spike, the bunker fuel that powers every cargo ship on every ocean gets more expensive simultaneously. This is not a regional story. A single threatened choke point in the Persian Gulf raises the operating cost of maritime trade on routes that have nothing to do with the Middle East. The Cape of Good Hope reroute was already burning 40% more fuel per voyage. When the fuel itself gets more expensive on top of that, the compounding effect lands directly on the freight rate, and the freight rate lands directly on the shelf price. Marcus's grocery bill and Priya's shrinking discretionary income are not just absorbing the cost of one conflict. They are absorbing the compound interest of several simultaneous geographic fractures, each one feeding the next. So where does this leave you practically? The supply chain research is pointing in a clear direction. According to a December 2025 survey of retail supply chain leaders, 77% of companies have already shifted sourcing away from China toward tariff-neutral countries, and 84% expect to restructure their logistics partnerships by 2026. These companies are pursuing nearshoring, which means manufacturing closer to end consumers to reduce dependence on transoceanic routes. That trend has a name, and it has a financial implication for individual investors. Nearshoring means new domestic and near-domestic manufacturing investment. It means industrial real estate demand in Mexico, the American South, and parts of Central America. It means logistics companies that operate short-haul regional networks are gaining structural advantage over companies built around long-haul trans-Pacific operations. The Drewry World Container Index, which tracks freight rates on major lanes, shows sustained elevated pricing on long routes even as rate volatility has returned. Short-haul and near-continental routes have shown comparatively more stability. If you are building a portfolio over the next decade, the logistics fragmentation happening right now is not a crisis to survive. It is a structural shift to position around. Industrial REITs with heavy North American warehouse exposure, domestic trucking and rail operators, and companies in the nearshore manufacturing supply chain are all gaining from the same disruption that is costing Priya her discretionary income. Here is the reframe to carry with you. The standard narrative says inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Print too much money, prices rise. Tighten financial conditions, prices fall. That framework explains 2022 well. It does not fully explain the stickiness of 2026. The money supply shock has cooled. The Fed held rates elevated for years. And yet prices in key categories have not retreated at the same pace they rose. What structural supply chain friction does is prevent prices from falling back down even after the monetary conditions that initially drove them up have normalized. Physical geography, and specifically the ability to move goods safely across oceans, turns out to be a financial variable that monetary policy cannot directly fix. When a cargo route breaks, it does not just delay a shipment. It devalues the purchasing power of anyone downstream from that route, which is almost everyone in a global economy. Marcus in Columbus and Priya in Phoenix are not losing their financial footing because of policy failures they can vote to reverse. They are absorbing the cost of a conflict thousands of miles away that has quietly rerouted the entire logistics infrastructure of global trade. The headline CPI number fell. The real cost of living did not follow at the same pace. And until the physical routes stabilize, or until nearshore infrastructure matures enough to offer a genuine alternative, that gap between the reported number and the felt number will persist. What you can do right now is understand this clearly enough to stop being surprised by it. Stop treating your grocery budget as a personal finance problem to be optimized away. Start treating it as a signal from a broken global system, one that does have investable solutions on the other side. The companies building the next logistics infrastructure closer to home are being funded right now. The question is whether you know enough to be on the right side of that bet. If this reframe shifted how you think about inflation, share it with one person who is still blaming the Fed for their grocery bill.